After dismantling Bob Dutko's fourth proof for the truth of the Bible, that of so-called fulfilled prophecies concerning Jesus from the Old Testament, we now turn to Dutko's fifth proof that the Bible is true, archaeology.
Number 5. The number 5 proof the Bible is true is archaeology supports the Bible. That's right, archaeology itself. Now let me say, everything in the Bible has not been found in archaeology because a bunch of stuff biodegrades, turns to dust. However, a lot of things in archaeology have been found that are in the Bible. So everything archaeologically that's been found supports the Bible.
Of course, that's a pretty tall claim. What Dutko does to support his assertion in the 18 minutes he devotes to his $20 CD to this fifth proof is rattle off a long list of people, places, and things that have been found archaeologically that have some sort of parallel in either the Old or the New Testament. In this examination of Dutko's fifth claim that supports the truth of the Bible, we will not be taking each of these items individually, as doing so is completely unnecessary, as we'll soon discover. We'll look at these examples more broadly, highlighting a few of the more interesting ones, but most can be disposed of more generally, without devoting time to every name or place or thing that Dutko provides. What is far more important is what archaeology tells us about the Bible that doesn't support Dutko's claim for its truth value. These are claims not surprisingly skipped or unknown to Dutko during his fifth proof. To be sure, there are many people, places, and things mentioned in the Bible that have archaeological and historical corroboration. Dutko lists a good number of them, including Augustus, Emperor of Rome, and mentioned in the infancy narrative of Luke as the one who ordered a census to be taken that resulted in the Holy Family traveling to Bethlehem. Again, Dutko notes the discovery of his tomb. King Cyrus of Persia, who allowed the Jewish people to return to Jerusalem following the Babylonian exile, as detailed in the book of Ezra, has been confirmed as a historical figure from a cylinder found mentioning Cyrus's name. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, who laid siege to Jerusalem, destroyed its temple, and carried the Jewish people into exile, as narrated in the book of Jeremiah, is mentioned in archaeological discoveries. The city of Capernaum, referred to many times in the New Testament and home, if we are to believe the narratives, of one of the Gospel's traditionally ascribed authors, Matthew, has been unearthed. The pool of Gibeon from 2 Samuel 2 has been uncovered. The royal palace of Samaria, as mentioned in 1 and 2 Kings, has been found. The royal palace of Babylon, mentioned in Daniel 5, has likewise been unearthed. The pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem has been discovered. Herod's palace, where Paul was kept under guard in Acts 23, has been found, and so on and so forth. All of these people and places are indeed featured in the Bible, and they do show up in the archaeological record. The problem here is that Dutko's list of these historical figures and locations has no bearing on the truth value of the biblical stories in which they appear. Augustus, for example, really was an emperor of Rome around the turn of the 1st century CE. But does his existence prove he ordered a census that caused Judean families to uproot themselves to travel to ancestral homes in the 1st century? Most scholars doubt the historicity of the biblical claim. Or does finding the pool of Bethesda give historical proof that at this place Jesus miraculously healed a paralyzed man, as told in the story from the 5th chapter of the Gospel of John? These proofs are no more evidence for the truth value of the biblical stories than the historical evidence that there once existed two twin towers in New York City is proof that at one time a helicopter became suspended between the buildings in a giant web, or that there exists a superhero named Spider-Man. Additionally, many of Dutko's criticisms deal with skeptical arguments that are a century or more old and are no longer used. For example, Dutko mentions that skeptics once argued that the Assyrian king Sargon, mentioned in the biblical book of Isaiah, was not a real person because Assyrian king lists never mentioned him. Then, a discovery made in the small village of Khoresbad, Iraq, proved the existence of Sargon. The trouble here is that this discovery was made in 1843. No skeptic of the Bible in over 150 years has made the argument that Sargon wasn't a real person. To be fair, these criticisms were at one time offered and then subsequently answered by archaeological discoveries, so maybe Dutko has a point in bringing them up in his Top 10 Proofs CD as evidence that skeptical arguments are sometimes overturned by later discoveries. But what does that tell you? It tells you the skepticism is built on the very foundation that all skepticism, not just biblical skepticism, is based: lack of evidence. But skepticism is satisfied when such evidence is produced. What is wrong with that? Dutko and his apologetic ilk seem to want to argue that all skepticism of the Bible is misplaced because some of that skepticism has been answered with discoveries. But that's how all good science works. And just because some criticisms have been silenced, that does not mean they all have been. And in fact, some discoveries have actually disproven, or at least called into serious question, certain assertions of the Bible. Take the tale of Jericho. As detailed in my production, The Walls of Jericho, there is ample evidence that this biblical story is pure fantasy. And besides, does the discovery of the historical Sargon prove that this future king of the Akkadian Empire was born the illegitimate son of a high priestess and set adrift on a river in a basket of reeds like Moses? Or proof of the existence of the Mesopotamian goddess Inanna, who, according to a legend parallel to the Joseph story in Genesis, prevented Sargon's murder by Zababa, king of Kish, after the interpretation of a dream? I doubt Dutko's enthusiasm would grant archaeology's discovery of Sargon as a historical figure proof of these Mesopotamian myths. Dutko's list of historical persons as proof the Bible is true contains names that are not exclusive biblical characters at all, but merely supporting cast members, such as Pontius Pilate, Nebuchadnezzar, and Tiglath-Pileser. Missing is archaeological proof for such major biblical figures as Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, and Joshua. Most biblical scholars doubt any of these biblically exclusive characters historically existed. But then there are other biblical people for whom there is little or no direct archaeological evidence for their existence. People like David, Solomon, Josiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, whom I'm persuaded did exist historically in some sense, in spite of a lack of direct evidence. Some characters in the Bible are merely mythological figures, like the aforementioned Adam or Noah, and exist because they were invented by scribes. We are never going to find archaeological proof for their existence. Then there are legendary figures like Moses and Joshua, who may be based upon historical figures but were nothing like their descriptions in the biblical text. Archaeological proof for their biblical personas are not going to turn up. And then there are historical figures like Josiah, about whom biblical stories were written for which we have no direct archaeological attestation, but enough circumstantial evidence exists that we can reasonably assume their historicity as people. But this is a far cry from confirming everything written about them in the biblical text. If we find archaeological evidence for figures like David or Solomon, that evidence will only confirm that people with these names existed, and not be evidence that biblical claims about these individuals are equally historical. In other words, the archaeological discovery of the Tel Dan stele, upon which was found an inscription reading House of David, at least confirming that an Israelite dynasty claiming connection with David, is not evidence in and of itself that this individual took rock to sling and struck down a giant Philistine named Goliath. Dutko's use of established historical people and places found archaeologically, which also appear in biblical stories, does nothing to provide evidence that the Bible is true, at least not in the sense of truth that apologists like him use the term. The discovery of the legendary city of Troy, for example, is not proof of war at the location between the Trojans and Greeks sometime in the 13th or 12th century BCE, as narrated in the works of Homer. And even if evidence of such a conflict were discovered archaeologically, that would not constitute proof for the existence of a warrior king named Odysseus, and much less proof of the existence of Greek gods Hermes, Athena, Poseidon, or Zeus. In closing his fifth proof for the truth of the Bible, Dutko marshals support for his claims by stating,
Finally, I want to read to you some quotes from some of the world's most respected archaeologists. For example, Dr. Clifford Wilson, the former director of the Australian Institute of Archaeology, says, quote, "I know of no finding in archaeology that's properly confirmed, which is in opposition to the scriptures. The Bible is the most accurate history textbook the world has ever seen."
What Dutko fails to tell his audience is that Dr. Clifford A. Wilson was an Australian young Earth creationist. The so-called Australian Institute of Archaeology is nothing more than a front to promote conservative Christian ideals. Their website states the organization was founded in 1946 as a private organization to promote the scientific study of the ancient world, especially the period contemporary with the biblical narrative. Additionally, the Institute was established with a conservative scientific tradition, and the focus of the Institute's founders is to give special attention to archaeology as it illuminates the culture and context of the biblical narrative. Hardly an unbiased scientific approach. Dr. Wilson's books include Visual Highlights of the Bible, published by Pacific Christian Ministries, with a foreword by Henry Morris, co-founder of the Creation Research Society and the Institute for Creation Research, and considered by many to be the father of modern creation science. Wilson's other book, Crash Goes Darwin and His Origin of Species, being a critique of one of the greatest fallacies the world has ever known, also published by Pacific Christian Ministries, has a foreword by another American creationist, Duane Gish, former vice president of the aforementioned Institute for Creation Research. Clifford Wilson is hardly one of the world's most respected archaeologists. Dutko continues,
Dr. Bryant C. Wood, Ph.D. archaeologist, said, quote, "In every instance where the findings of archaeology pertain to the biblical record, the archaeological evidence confirms, sometimes in detailed fashion, the historical accuracy of Scripture."
Bryant Wood's real middle initial is G, not C, but we've come to expect Dutko's lack of attention to detail throughout this series. Nonetheless, Wood is another conservative Christian with young Earth creationist beliefs, who is most notable for his argument that archaeological evidence for the destruction of Jericho lines up perfectly with his understanding of biblical chronology. Dr. Wood's assertions were meticulously examined and found lacking in my The Walls of Jericho video. Dr. Wood is another figure hardly to be confused with one of the world's most respected archaeologists. Wood is an employee of yet another conservative Christian organization dedicated to the defense of the inerrancy of the Bible, the Associates for Biblical Research. Again, Wood does not rank among the world's most respected archaeologists. Dutko then brings up,
The late Dr. Nelson Glueck, archaeologist, said, quote, "It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. Scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline or exact detail historical statements in the Bible."
Here, Dutko finally does list a respected archaeologist who didn't happen to share creationists' ideas. Unfortunately, Dr. Glueck died in 1971, and so his conclusion just quoted is extremely dated, as we'll see in a moment. Dutko then refers to
Dr. Joseph Free, Ph.D. archaeologist, Wheaton College's former 20-year head of the Department of Archaeology, said, quote, "We do not know of any cases where the Bible has been proven wrong."
Free died in 1974. Again, an important detail which will become evident shortly. Similarly, Free's book, Archaeology and Bible History, from which Dutko's quote is taken, was originally published in 1950. It contains such assertions that ancient seals, found depicting a tree, a man, a woman, and a snake, found in excavations around archaeological sites like Nineveh, suggest the reality of a Garden of Eden. Free then goes on in his book to muse over what he thinks is a prophecy about Christ in Genesis 3:15. Do we really want to take seriously a man who would interpret the Hebrew Genesis through a Christian filter? Is this even archaeology? Dutko finishes his list by quoting from probably the most famous of biblical archaeologists, undoubtedly the founder of the biblical archaeology movement itself, which flourished in the early to mid-20th century. As Dutko put it,
Dr. William F. Albright, You know who Dr. Albright was? One of the world's most preeminent archaeologists. As a matter of fact, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, they called on Dr. Albright to be the archaeologist to authenticate them. In eastern Jerusalem is the oldest American research center in the Middle East. Guess what it's called? The W.F. Albright Institute of Archaeological Research. This is how respected this guy is. You want to hear a quote from him? Quote, "There can be no doubt that archaeology has confirmed the substantial historicity of the Old Testament tradition." End quote.
There is no question about the importance of a man like William F. Albright, but his methods weren't as airtight as apologists like Dutko would have their audiences believe. What does substantial historicity even mean? What is regarded as substantial and what is not? Who makes that determination? As Megan Bishop Moore, adjunct professor of religion at Wake Forest University, and Brad E. Kell, assistant professor of biblical literature, Point Loma Nazarene University, note in their book, Biblical History and Israel's Past, The Changing Study of the Bible and History, the most notable example of the inadequacy of Albright's approach is the Albright School's belief that Hebrew tribes leaving Egypt conquered Canaan, as reported primarily in the book of Joshua. Albright and his students recognized that archaeology did not agree with the Joshua account in many aspects, but they held on to the essential historicity of the account by finessing certain details and explaining away the discrepancies. These changes allowed historians to maintain the historicity of the conquest in the face of tendentious archaeological evidence. This Albright-led method of interpreting archaeology through the filter of the Bible, of explaining away discrepancies and finessing certain details, would inevitably come to an end, as the scientific search for the truth of the archaeological record would win out against the agenda-led method of trying to prove the Bible true. As William Deaver, former professor of Near Eastern archaeology and anthropology at the University of Arizona and author of many books on the archaeology of Israel, Palestine, Syria, and the ancient Near East, notes, Albright is long gone. He died in 1971, and all his achievements have been undermined. The archaeological search for the historicity of the events in question has all but been abandoned. The biblical archaeology movement that Albright spearheaded underwent a collapse beginning around 1970. By the mid-1980s, the old-style biblical archaeology, of the type typified by Albright, Free, and Gleck, had reinvented itself as a secular branch of Near Eastern archaeology, divorced from the theologically driven American Protestant-dominated practitioners of the early to mid-20th century. The reborn discipline, much more professional and specialized, was first styled Syro-Palestinian archaeology to broaden it beyond the immediate world of the Bible and Israel. But in view of the political realities in the region, the preferred name has become Levantine or Southern Levantine archaeology, or simply the archaeology of Israel or of Jordan, now excluding Syria. The biblical texts are still considered important, but only when assessed separately and critically, and even then, only as secondary sources for archaeology and history writing. So what changed with the demise of the Albright School of Biblical Archaeology? There was a seismic shift in the understanding of Israel's origins. Gone was the Bible's story of an exodus from Egypt by upwards of 3 million people, the desert wandering of 40 years, and the blitzkrieg-like military conquest of Canaan commanded by Joshua and his Hebrew army. As Deaver notes about archaeological research into the Sinai wandering, for example, noting how discoveries have not been able to confirm the biblical story, dozens of sites are mentioned, plus more than 30 in Transjordan mentioned in Numbers 33 alone. But archaeologists have searched diligently to identify and locate any of the Sinai desert sites, especially when the Israelis held the Sinai after the 1973 war. Only 2 can be located with any confidence. Migdol, near the beginning of the journey, has been identified with Tel El Borg, near the east bank of the Nile and the modern canal. It was an Egyptian border fortress during the time in question, hardly a place for wanderers to camp, even in small numbers. Kadesh Barnea is the site where the Hebrews were said to have been held up for 38 years, certainly enough time to have left substantial remains, especially for a large group. This site is clearly to be located at a small oasis near Ein Kadis in the eastern Sinai, the Arabic name Cadiz preserving the Hebrew name Kadesh. The site was extensively excavated by Israeli archaeologists when they held the Sinai, keen to establish a connection with the biblical story. On the small tell or mound, however, there are only 3 superimposed forts, dating respectively to the 10th, the 8th, and the 7th centuries BCE. Earlier than that, there are no structures, only a scattering of shards. At most, a few stragglers passed this way in the late 13th or early 12th century BCE, making the site virtually uninhabitable at the time the Bible places the Hebrews there during their escape from Egypt. When the Hebrew forces moved north, several great victories are claimed, notably at Heshbon and Dibon. Biblical Heshbon is clearly to be located at the site with the Arabic name of Hesbon, a few miles south of modern Amman. The prominent mound was extensively excavated by devout Seventh-day Adventist archaeologists from 1968 to 1978, who no doubt confidently expected to find destruction levels dating to the late 13th century BCE or so. But the site was not really occupied before the 12th or 11th centuries BCE, and even then it was only a small, unfortified village, hardly the capital of Sion, king of the Amorites. The excavators, excellent archaeologists, faced up to the problem gallantly, and they declared Heshbon to be, quote, the first casualty in the war, that is, in their own battle to confirm Scripture. The site of Dibon has fared no better. Again, the location is not in doubt. Biblical Dibon is the Mount of Dibon in Arabic, farther south in Moab. It was excavated in the 1950s and 1960s, again by conservative American Christian scholars, this time Southern Baptists. Here, there seems to be no remains whatsoever before the 9th century BCE. This is indeed miraculous. A city that was not even there was conquered, if we are to believe the biblical narrative. Moving on to the stories of the book of Joshua, Deaver states after he notes there being no evidence of an Israelite conquest of Jericho, the next obvious target coming up from Jericho to the central hill country was the site of Ai, the ruin heap. The complex biblical story of its supposed destruction is told in Joshua 6 and 7. Here, too, the location of biblical Ai is not in dispute. Excavations of the great 27-acre mound were carried out by French excavators in 1933 to 1935, and again by American excavators in 1964 through 1970, the latter directed by Southern Baptist scholar Joseph Calloway. Here, the silence of the text is deafening. There are no remains. The site was entirely abandoned by about 2500 BCE and remained deserted until a small Israelite village was founded directly on those ruins, probably in the 12th century BCE. Of all the total 38 sites that Joshua and Numbers claims were utterly destroyed, there is really only one candidate for any destruction in the light of what we now know: Hazor, the head of all those kingdoms. The account of the fiery destruction and the annihilation of the entire populace is contained in Joshua 11. The site was extensively excavated by the famed Israeli archaeologist Yagael Yadin in 1955 and 1958, and again by Amnon Ben-Tor in 1990 through 2017. Here, there really is a destruction, and a horrific one. Yadin had confidently identified Joshua's Israelites as the destroyers. Ben-Tor generally agrees, but he is not quite as dogmatic. His co-director, the late Sharon Zuckerman, thinks that internecine war between rival Canaanite rulers is a more likely explanation. There, the matter rests. But out of the 38 cities said to be destroyed in the biblical narrative, that is not very good odds. Given then what modern archaeology has discovered, long after Dutko's cherry-picked pre-1970 quotes to support his assertion that archaeology supports the truth of the Bible, Deaver and most modern archaeologists in the field concludes, the biblical book of Joshua is almost certainly a work of fiction, celebrating in an exaggerated fashion the exploits of a legendary military hero. And this assessment extends beyond the early Exodus and conquest stories and into the archaeological evidence for the United Kingdoms of Israel and Judah and the monarchies of David and his son Solomon. As Francisca Stavrokopoulou, professor of Hebrew Bible and ancient religion at the University of Exeter, writes, Initially, archaeological studies appeared to support this image of Solomon as a successful royal builder, for excavations at Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezir revealed defense systems exhibiting almost identical architectural features. From this sprang the persistent supposition that one central authority must have been responsible for these seemingly parallel fortification patterns. Given the biblical material, Solomon was widely credited with instigating these tokens of statehood. However, the biblical concept of Israel and Judah as one state divided into two is increasingly considered historically improbable. This position draws strength from three significant developments within scholarship since the late 1980s and 1990s: the re-evaluation of archaeological evidence, the considerable contribution of social scientific investigations, and the increasing consensus arguing for the later dating of the biblical texts well beyond the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, all of which have undermined the assumption of the basic historicity of the biblical description of a united, then divided monarchy. She goes on to conclude, the bedrock of archaeological evidence supporting the united monarchy of David and Solomon has suffered serious erosion. Deaver sums up what modern archaeological discoveries suggest about the biblical story of Israel's early history. The biblical version of Israel's history is an ideal history, a portrait not of what Israel actually was, but of what it should have been, had it conformed to Orthodox Yahwehism. By that term, we mean the religious beliefs and practices of the elites who wrote and edited the Hebrew Bible, right-wing, Orthodox, nationalist parties, and the literati in Jerusalem. Thus it should come as no surprise that the Bible presents a revisionist history that fails to represent the views and the practices of the majority. Scholars thus draw a contrast. On the one hand, there is the Orthodox cult, or what may be called book religion. This is the ideal institutionalized religion of the Bible. Then there is popular or folk religion. The biblical writers condemn the latter, a perversion in their view, and try to call Israel back to an original, purer version, theirs. But their religion was an ideal, almost never the reality, an ideal that they projected back upon a largely imaginary past. So no, the world of archaeology as it is in the 21st century is not supportive of the biblical narrative as it was in the early and mid-20th century, the era and mindset from which Dutko pulls his quotes. Times have changed. Evidence has continued to be found and evaluated, and much of the Bible is no longer considered reliable in building a true picture of Israel's origins, to say nothing about the origin of life, of humanity, the world, and the universe. In our next program, we will consider a couple of unique archaeological locations that Dutko mentions in his discussion of archaeology as supporting the truth of the Bible that should be examined in a bit more detail. Funding for this program was provided in part by the generous contributions of viewers like you via Patreon. Consider joining them at www.patreon.com/Bible Skeptic. Thank you.